For nearly 2 centuries, the story of Davy Crockett came preloaded with a pedigree almost as colorful as the man himself. Textbooks, biographies, and even plaques at historical societies repeated the same tale. The king of the wild frontier descended from French nobility, from a Huguenot captain in the personal guard of King Louis XIV, who fled religious persecution, crossed an ocean, and planted the seeds of a family that would eventually produce one of America's most mythologized frontiersmen. It was a good story. It gave a backwoods congressman and bear hunter a whiff of aristocratic origin, a secret bloodline running beneath the coonskin cap. It was also, as far as genetic genealogists can tell, almost entirely invented. Over the past 2 decades, a quiet but painstaking research effort, built not on newly unearthed letters or dusty parish registers, but on Y-chromosome DNA testing, has picked apart the Crockett family's cherished French ancestry story thread by thread. The project didn't just fail to confirm the legend, it actively contradicted it, showing that the men who claim descent from the supposed Huguenot founder aren't even genetically related to one another, let alone to a single shared 17th century ancestor. And in doing so, the DNA testing didn't hand Davy Crockett a true ancestry to replace the fake one. It did something stranger and, in its own way, more interesting. It stripped the legend away and left a gap. Davy Crockett's ancestry beyond his grandfather remains, by the best current evidence, unknown. This is the story of how that discovery came about, why the French nobleman legend took hold so completely in the first place, and what it means that America's arch-frontiersman, a man built almost entirely out of legend to begin with, turns out to have a genealogy that is, itself, largely legend. To understand what DNA testing overturned, you first have to understand what everyone believed for so long. The standard version of Davy Crockett's family history, repeated in biography after biography and eventually enshrined on genealogy websites and even for a time on Wikipedia, went something like this. The family's founder was a French nobleman named Gabriel de Crocketagne, born around Ans, 1600 in Montauban, a Huguenot stronghold in southern France. Gabriel's son, Antoine de Crocketagne, sometimes rendered with an even longer, more aristocratic-sounding name, Antoine des Ossures Perronet de Crocketagne, held a commission in the household troops of King Louis XIV. When the king revoked the Edict of Nantes in 1685, stripping French Protestants of their legal protections, the Crocketagne family fled France for religious safety, eventually settling in the north of Ireland, where the name was anglicized to the more familiar Crockett. From there, the story continues. The family made its way to the American colonies. One popular version holds that David Crockett's own father, John, was born aboard the ship carrying the family across the Atlantic. Eventually, the Crocketts pushed west and south through the colonies, into the Blue Ridge, and ultimately into the mountains of what would become Tennessee, where David Crockett, the man who would grow up to be Davy, was born in 1786 near the Nolichucky River. It's a compelling narrative, and it did real cultural work. It gave a man whose life was already substantially mythologized, a congressman, a folk hero, an author of a wildly embellished autobiography, and eventually a martyr at the Alamo. An origin, story with some old world gravitas attached. A frontier legend with noble blood in his veins made for a better plaque, a better biography chapter, a better line in a Daughters of the American Revolution or Huguenot Society application. And that's exactly how the story spread. It wasn't confined to folklore or barroom talk. It was formalized in print, most influentially in a genealogical compilation called Notable Southern Families, the Crockett Family, researched and written by Louise Crockett French and John Crockett Armstrong. That book, treated for decades as close to gospel by Crockett descendants and genealogists alike, connected numerous different Crockett family lines across the American South back to the supposed founder, Antoine de Crocketagne. From there, the Crocketagne genealogy found its way into Huguenot Society records, Daughters of Texas, Revolution materials, and popular biographies of Davy Crockett himself. Genealogy websites built elaborate family trees around it. Antoine de Crocketagne and his relatives even acquired their own memorial pages on genealogy platforms, virtual monuments to people whose burial locations, and in some cases whose very existence, nobody could actually verify. For most of the 20th century, there was little reason for anyone to look harder. Genealogy before the DNA era relied on documents, parish records, land grants, wills, family Bibles, oral tradition passed down and eventually written into county histories. And for a family that crossed an ocean, then crossed a continent, in the chaotic and thinly documented world of colonial and frontier America, documentary trails run cold fast. The Crocketagne story filled that gap. It was detailed, specific, and dramatic. A French nobleman, a religious flight, a name change, an Atlantic crossing. It had the texture of real history, even if, as it turned out, almost none of it could be verified by an actual document. The first serious cracks in the Crocketagne narrative didn't come from genetic testing at all. They came from old-fashioned document hunting, and from something almost embarrassingly basic. Nobody could actually find Antoine de Crockett or his father Gabriel in any French record. Genealogists and Crockett descendants who traveled to France and Ireland specifically to verify the story came back empty-handed. More than one researcher who consulted French genealogists directly was told something striking. De Crockett wasn't simply a name that had gone undocumented. It wasn't recognized as a French surname at all. No church registers, no noble rolls, no household guard commission records, nothing tying a Gabriel or an Antoine de Crockett to Montauban or to the court of Louis XIV could be located. The claim that Huguenots were ordered out of France following the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, a detail repeated in many versions of the family story to explain the flight to Ireland, also turned out to be historically backwards. Louis XIV's policy initially forbade Huguenots from leaving the kingdom, since the goal was forced conversion, not expulsion. In other words, long before anyone spit into a test tube, the paper trail for the Crockett legend was already looking suspiciously thin. But a compelling story with a 2-century head start doesn't die just because the documentation is missing. It had already been printed, cited, and recited so many times across so many sources that it had achieved a kind of self-reinforcing credibility. Each new biography or genealogy that repeated the Crockett story treated the previous ones as evidence, when in reality they were all typically drawing, directly or indirectly, from the same unverified 19th century source material. Most notably, an 1858 letter written by a man named D.T. Maury, which appears to be the true origin point of the entire Crockett narrative more than a century after the fact. What was needed wasn't another document search. It was a way to test the biological claim itself, the assertion that a large number of Crockett families scattered across the American South all descended from one 17th century man, and by the early 2000s, that kind of test had become possible. The tool that eventually broke the Crockett story open is a relatively simple, if powerful piece of human biology, the Y chromosome. Because the Y chromosome passes from father to son, largely unchanged from generation to generation, it functions almost like a genetic surname, a marker that, in theory, should track right alongside an actual family surname passed down the male line. Two men who share a paternal line ancestor within the genealogically relevant past should share closely matching Y DNA. Two men whose family trees are unrelated, even if they happen to share a common surname, should not. This made Y-DNA testing an almost perfectly designed tool for testing the Crockett claim, because that claim was, at its core, a claim about shared paternal descent. If dozens of different Crockett families across Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, and beyond really did all descend from one 17th century Huguenot nobleman, their Y-DNA should reflect that shared ancestry, converging on a single genetic signature. Starting in the 2000s, a group organized as the Crockett Family DNA Project, hosted through the genealogical testing company Family Tree DNA, began recruiting men with the Crockett surname, and specifically men who believed themselves to be descendants of Davy Crockett or of the broader Crockett lineage, to submit Y DNA samples. The project has run for roughly 2 decades now, and it has become one of the more detailed and closely watched surname DNA projects in American genealogy, precisely because of who is at its center. The results didn't just fail to confirm the unified Crockett ancestry story. They actively dismantled it. The most direct blow to the legend came from identifying the actual Y DNA signature of David Crockett's own confirmed line, the line running back through his grandfather, David Crockett, the Elder, and reaching down to Davy Crockett himself. Multiple proven descendants of David the Elder's sons, William, Joseph, and Alexander, were tested, and their results matched. This branch of the Crockett family carries a Y DNA haplogroup called IM223, and more specifically, an unusually rare subclade of it known as IY32632. That detail matters more than it might seem. IM223 itself is not especially common in Europe, found in roughly 2 to 4% of the population, concentrated with somewhat higher frequency in Britain, Ireland, and parts of Scandinavia. But the specific branch carried by Davy Crockett's confirmed paternal line, IY32632, is rarer still. So rare that only a handful of participants in the entire worldwide family tree DNA database share it. In practical terms, that means this particular Y DNA signature acts almost like a fingerprint. If other Crockett family lines that claim descent from Antoine de Crockett actually shared a common 17th century ancestor with Davy Crockett's family, their Y DNA should show the same rare marker, or something closely related to it. It doesn't. The other major Crockett lines that had been folded into the Crockett narrative by notable Southern families, including descendants connected to names like Robert Watkins Crockett and Joseph Louis Crockett, families with roots in Augusta, Montgomery, and Wythe counties in Virginia, turned out to carry an entirely different haplogroup altogether, RM269, one of the most common Y DNA lineages in Western Europe and found throughout the British Isles. RM269 and IM223 are not closely related branches of the human Y chromosome tree. They represent genuinely separate, deep paternal lineages. Men carrying RM269 and men carrying IM223 do not share a common paternal ancestor within any genealogically meaningful time frame, certainly not within the few hundred years the Crockettian story would require. This is, in blunt terms, exactly the kind of result that disproves a shared ancestor claim rather than confirms it. It isn't ambiguous or open to interpretation the way a missing document might be. Two men either share a recent common paternal ancestor, reflected in closely matching Y DNA, or they don't. And what the Crockett DNA project found is that the families, notable Southern families, had spent an entire book connecting into one grand Crockettian family tree were, genetically, several unrelated families that happened to share a surname. As the project's later summaries put it plainly, the Y DNA results prove that many of the Crockett lines connected in French and Armstrong's book are unrelated by blood. It wasn't simply that Antoine de Crockettin couldn't be documented. It was that the biological claim built on top of him, that dozens of scattered Crockett families were all his descendants, was demonstrably false. By 2025, project organizers, summarizing years of accumulated testing, had identified at least 6 distinct, genetically separate Crockett family lines among project participants, along with a substantial number of matchless participants whose Y DNA didn't cluster with any of the established groups at all. Their conclusion, after 2 decades of testing, was about as direct as genealogical writing gets. There is inadequate documentation to prove that Antoine de Crockettin ever existed, and even if he did, there's no way to determine which, if any, of the tested Crockett lines descend from him. There's a detail here worth sitting with, because it's easy to skip past on the way to the headline finding. The DNA testing didn't just fail to prove the French nobleman's story, it proved something almost more surprising in its own right. A huge number of families sharing the surname Crockett across the American South are not related to one another at all, at least not within any time frame that matters for family history. This makes intuitive sense once you think about how surnames actually worked in the British Isles centuries ago. Surnames derived from occupations, locations, or descriptive nicknames were frequently adopted independently by unrelated families in different regions. A family living near a rocky outcropping might independently pick up a name meaning roughly that, without any connection to another family who acquired a similar name 100 miles away for entirely separate reasons. Multiple genuinely separate Crockett lineages could have formed in Scotland, Ireland, and England over the centuries with zero common ancestor, and all of them could have emigrated to America, where the coincidence of a shared surname naturally invited later genealogists to assume a shared family tree. That's precisely what happened with notable Southern families. Confronted with multiple Crockett lines scattered across Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky, all without solid documentary connections to one another, the book's authors reached for the most famous and dramatic unifying story available, French Huguenot nobility fleeing persecution, and stitched everyone into it. It gave every Crockett family, whether or not they had any real connection to Davy Crockett's line, a claim to shared romantic ancestry. DNA testing pulled those threads apart. It confirmed that some of the other Crockett lines are related to each other. The RM269 families, for instance, cluster together and appear to share genuine common ancestry, going back to early Crockett settlers in places like Kent County, Delaware. But that cluster is not the same family as Davy Crockett's IM223 line. They are, genetically, 2 separate stories that got merged into one because they happen to share a last name and a convenient legend. If the Huguenot nobleman story falls apart under genetic scrutiny, what's left? This is where the DNA revelation becomes less a triumphant, here's the real answer story, and more a humbling one. The solid, documented, DNA-confirmed history of Davy Crockett's paternal line goes back reliably to his grandfather, a man usually recorded simply as David Crockett, sometimes called David the Elder by genealogists to distinguish him from the many other David and John Crocketts scattered through the records. David the Elder and his wife Elizabeth were living in the mountains of what's now northeastern Tennessee in the years just after the American Revolution began. Family tradition, which Davy Crockett himself repeated in his own autobiography, holds that his grandparents were killed in 1777 by Creek and Cherokee raiders near present-day Rogersville, Tennessee, while several of their sons, including Davy's father John, were away serving with colonial forces. Beyond David the Elder, though, the trail goes cold, genuinely cold, not we have a colorful story to fill the gap cold. Davy Crockett himself, writing his own life story, said only that his family was Irish, and family tradition long held that his father John had been born during the family's Atlantics. Crossing, though even that detail lacks solid documentary confirmation. Where exactly in Ireland, Scotland, or England the family originated before that crossing, who David the Elder's own parents were, whether the family had been in Ireland for generations or had arrived there more recently from Scotland or elsewhere in Britain. None of this has been established with any real confidence, genetic or documentary. This is precisely the gap the Crockettain legend was invented to fill. It's a deeply human genealogical impulse. When the real documentary record runs out, reach for the most impressive story available to bridge it, and let a French nobleman's flight from religious persecution paper over 3 or 4 generations of genuine, frustrating unknowns. DNA testing hasn't been able to close that gap either, at least not yet. What it has been able to do is definitively remove the false bridge that had been built across it. Warren Lawrence, a longtime figure in the Crockett family DNA project, put the state of the evidence about as honestly as it can be put back in 2009, noting that Davy's great-grandparents and everyone before them remain, in the real historical record, simply unknown, a conclusion that, if anything, has only been reinforced by everything the DNA project has learned since. The Crockettain story wasn't the only piece of inherited Crockett lore that later scrutiny picked apart, and it's worth a brief detour because it shows the same pattern at work. A colorful, prestige-boosting claim, widely repeated, that falls apart the moment anyone actually checks it against the documented facts. For years, some genealogies claimed that Davy Crockett was related, specifically a nephew, to John Sevier, the swashbuckling frontier soldier and Tennessee's first governor, one of the most celebrated figures in early Tennessee history. It's an appealing claim for the same reason the Crockettain story was appealing. It links an already famous frontier legend to another famous frontier legend, tightening the mythology of the whole region into a single, satisfying, interconnected family story. But the claim runs into an obvious problem, one that doesn't even require DNA to spot. Davy Crockett wrote a lengthy, famously self-promoting autobiography, and in it, he never once mentions being related to John Sevier. Given how thoroughly Crockett was willing to burnish his own reputation and connections throughout that book, and given how significant a link to Sevier, one of the most powerful men in early Tennessee, would have been to a struggling frontier politician trying to build a career, the silence is telling. As one local historian, summarizing the genealogical case against the Sevier connection put it, if the relationship had been real, Crockett would have milked that cow dry. He didn't, because as far as the actual evidence shows, there was no cow to milk. It's a smaller example than the Crockettain story, and it didn't need Y-DNA testing to unravel. Just a careful read of the documentary record Crockett himself left behind. But it illustrates the same underlying pattern that DNA testing would later expose on a much larger scale. America's most mythologized frontier figures accumulated genealogical mythology, the same way they accumulated tall tale exploits, and often for the same reason. Because a better story made for a better legend, and nobody was checking too closely. It's worth asking why the Crockettain story specifically proved so durable, since plenty of false genealogical claims fade quietly once challenged. A few things kept this one alive for well over a century. First, it was formalized in a widely trusted printed source. Notable Southern Families wasn't a random family Bible entry or a piece of oral tradition passed around a campfire. It was a researched, published genealogical compilation, the kind of source that later genealogists, biographers, and even hereditary societies treated as a legitimate secondary authority. Once a claim gets embedded in a source like that, it tends to get copied forward by every subsequent researcher who trusts the earlier work rather than starting from scratch, and each new citation makes the claim look more solid than the last, even though the underlying evidence never actually grows. Second, hereditary and lineage societies had an institutional incentive, however unintentional, to accept the story. Groups like the Daughters of Texas Revolution and various Huguenot heritage societies exist in part to formally document and celebrate specific ancestral connections. A well-documented-looking genealogy connecting a member to a dramatic, prestigious ancestor like a French Huguenot nobleman serves the purposes of that kind of organization neatly, and there was, for most of the 20th century, no efficient way to independently verify or challenge it. Third, and perhaps most simply, it's a genuinely good story. And Davy Crockett's entire public identity was already built out of good stories, many of them exaggerated or invented by Crockett himself, and by the popular press and entertainment industry that mythologized him further after his death at the Alamo. A frontier folk hero whose own authorized autobiography leaned heavily into tall tale self-mythology was, in a sense, the perfect vessel for one more layer of embellished legend. This one about where he came from, rather than what he did. DNA testing doesn't care about any of that. It doesn't care how many books repeated a claim, how prestigious the hereditary society attaching itself to it might be, or how satisfying the narrative arc is. It simply measures whether or not a biological relationship actually exists. And in this case, it measured and measured and measured again over 2 decades of an ongoing surname project. And the answer kept coming back the same: no. It's worth being precise about what the genetic evidence has and hasn't accomplished, because DNA revealed the truth can imply a tidier resolution than what actually happened. DNA testing did not hand genealogists a new confirmed ancestry to replace the old one. Nobody has sequenced a sample and announced with confidence, here is Davy Crockett's real 17th century ancestor, and here is the country he actually came from. What DNA testing accomplished was narrower, but arguably more valuable from a historical accuracy standpoint. It definitively ruled out a specific, long-accepted claim, and it clarified exactly where the confirmed family record actually ends. That's not a small thing. Distinguishing between what is actually known and what has simply been repeated, often enough to feel known, is one of the core, unglamorous jobs of real historical and genealogical research. And it's a job DNA evidence is particularly well suited for, because it doesn't accumulate the same way documentary folklore does. A false claim repeated in 50 books is still just one false claim. A Y-DNA mismatch tested across a dozen independent participants over 20 years is 12 independent pieces of hard evidence pointing the same direction. What's left, once the Crockettane legend is cleared away, is a more honest, if less flattering picture. Davy Crockett's confirmed ancestry runs solidly back to a grandfather killed by Native American raiders on the Tennessee frontier in 1777, and beyond that, into a genuine unknown, an Irish, or possible, a Scottish family of unclear origin, arriving in America at an uncertain time, for reasons and circumstances lost to the historical record. No nobleman, no Royal Guard commission, no dramatic religious flight from Louis XIV's France, at least none that any document or DNA test has ever been able to substantiate. There's something almost fitting about where this leaves the Crockett legend, even if it wasn't the outcome any Crockett descendant particularly hoped for. Davy Crockett's entire public identity, cultivated in his lifetime and amplified enormously after his death at the Alamo in 1836, was built around the idea of the self-made frontiersman, a man who rose from genuine backwoods, poverty, and obscurity to a seat in the U.S. Congress and national fame through grit, marksmanship, storytelling charisma, and sheer force of personality, not inherited privilege or family connection. His own autobiography, whatever its exaggerations, leaned hard into that narrative, a poor, largely uneducated boy from the Tennessee mountains who talked, hunted, and fought his way into American mythology. A secret aristocratic French pedigree sits a little awkwardly against that self-made man mythology, if you think about it. It suggests the frontier legend actually had a hidden leg up, a bit of old-world prestige quietly embedded in the bloodline all along, stripping that away and revealing instead a family. History that simply runs out into genuine, undocumented obscurity a few generations back, arguably brings the Crockett story back into closer alignment with the version Crockett himself was always trying to tell. A man who came from nothing identifiable and made himself into something the whole country would remember. The DNA testing that undid the Crockettane legend didn't set out to make that point. It set out to answer a much narrower, more technical question. Do these Crockett family lines actually share the common ancestor their genealogies claim? And it answered that question with a flat, unambiguous no, delivered across dozens of participants and 2 decades of ongoing testing. But in clearing away one of American folklore's more successful genealogical inventions, it left behind something that feels, in its own quiet way, truer to the man at the center of the story. Not a hidden nobleman's bloodline, but a frontier family whose real origins were, and largely remain, an open question, genuinely unknown, rather than simply unexamined. That, in the end, may be the most accurate legacy DNA testing could have handed Davy Crockett. Not a new legend to replace the old one, but the far less dramatic, far more honest admission that some parts of even the most mythologized American lives were never fully knowable to begin with. And that the willingness to invent a satisfying answer, rather than sit with the uncertainty, is its own very old American tradition.